I'd like to welcome you to the Political Participation Chapter 8 lecture. During this lecture, we're going to talk about political participation. And remember that as we've been going through the last several chapters, we're looking at the ways in which you as a citizen can directly connect with your government as a means of both making sure that they are well representing you, but also as a means of holding them accountable. So today we're going to talk about, again, one of those avenues. We've talked about the media, we will talk about elections, we'll talk about campaigns. All, like political participation, are means of connecting or linking you as a citizen with your government. When we talk about political participation, it's important first, obviously, that we define what we mean by political participation. And here you'll see a very good definition. That is that political participation refers to a wide range of political activities. So we're talking about here a broad range of political activities, but each one of them has as their primary purpose to attempt to influence the government. So when we talk about a wide range of activities, we can categorize them in two broad categories. The first is electoral participation. The word electoral is another word for voting. So electoral participation refers to voting, and as the slide tells you, it is obviously the most accessible and the most important form of political activity. It's the most accessible in the sense that there are minimum requirements for citizens to participate, and it requires very little effort. The other broad category of participation is non-electoral. So again, electoral meaning voting. Non-electoral participation refers to those types of participation that are non-voting. And you'll see a list there, including lobbying, where you as a citizen attempt to contact a member of government, either by yourself or as a member of an interest group, and you're trying to contact that member and persuade them to vote in a certain way. Public relations, which is obviously something that can't really be done as an individual, but more as a group, where you're running commercials on television or advertisements in newspapers, trying to influence government. Litigation, which is another word for filing a lawsuit. So that's a way that you can try to influence your government by filing a lawsuit. Go back in your mind and remember our discussion of Chapter 5 when we talked about the NAACP and their filing of Brown versus Board of Education as a means of influencing government. And finally, protest. And again, you have an excellent example of protest as a means of influencing government, looking at the protest Wall Street, the Occupy Wall Street, the Occupy Atlanta, all of those movements. Now, while there are a broad array of non-electoral forms of participation, these are used less often than is voting, and the reason for that is simple, that each of these forms of participation require more time, they require more money, and certainly they require more effort than simply voting. So we see citizens engaging in these latter forms of participation very rarely. In fact, here is a figure that demonstrates that. Again, we have to be wary of how political polls are conducted, but according to the results of this poll, 76% of those polled say that they vote on a regular basis. So as you can see, voting by far the most utilized form of participation. And then if you look at those non-electoral forms like volunteering for a campaign or making donations to a campaign, contacting a member of government, or attending local community meetings or political rallies, you can see that each one of those forms of non-electoral participation has lower rates of participation, and the reason being that obviously they require more time and effort, and people can't necessarily devote that to those activities. So we can see that voting is the most important form of participation. When we talk about voting, it's important to talk about who is allowed to vote. Remember, in the very first slide we said that voting is the most accessible form of participation. So that's what I want to focus on for just a moment, which is the accessible part. That is, who can vote. Now, the most important thing for you to remember here is that states are allowed to determine who has the right to vote. According to the Constitution and according to the 10th Amendment, remember, all powers not enumerated to the national government in Article 1 are reserved to the states through the 10th Amendment. The power to regulate voting is not in Article 1. Therefore, it is reserved to the states. So states have the ability to determine who within their state has the right to vote. However, they have to abide by some general federal guidelines, and that's what I want to focus on here for a moment. The first and most important guideline that states have to work within is the parameters set by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, if we go back in our minds, we remember that during really at the end of the Civil War, so in the 1860s through the 1960s, so about 100 years after the end of the Civil War, southern states used a number of barriers to prevent African Americans from voting. Remember, the 15th Amendment said that the right to vote could not be denied based on race. So southern states were not allowed to prohibit blacks from voting because they were in fact black. So they got creative, and they found a number of other ways of preventing these newly freed slaves from exercising the franchise. Things like the poll taxes, where you had to pay to vote, or the literacy test, where you had to pass a test in order to vote, and then finally the grandfather clause, which said if your grandfather couldn't vote before 1865, neither could you. And so each one of these things, these barriers, were used by southern states and were upheld by the Supreme Court as not violating the 15th Amendment, because they weren't discriminating against newly freed slaves because of their race, but for the fact that they were poor and illiterate and had family members that had been slaves. In 1965, a law was passed by the United States Congress called the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it overturned all of those discriminatory voting practices. That doesn't mean, however, that there aren't some barriers to voting that still exist today and that can, in fact, prevent people from exercising their right to vote. And we'll talk about those in just a second. In fact, if you look at the blog posting for this week, you will see that not only are there existing barriers to voting, but that states are actually expanding those in many ways as a means of limiting the number of people that can vote. Beyond the Voting Rights Act, states cannot discriminate based on gender. That was secured with the 19th Amendment, and that anyone under the age of 18 must be allowed to vote under the 26th Amendment. So if you're, I don't mean under the age of 18, I mean over the age of 18. So anyone over the age of 18 who is a natural or naturalized citizen, so they just must be a citizen, is allowed to vote within some general guidelines. Now, there are some requirements that still exist. In fact, let me skip forward for a moment and we'll come back and look at some of these other things. We call these formal obstacles to voting. We call these formal obstacles to voting, and they are things like registration requirements, that before you are allowed to vote, you must register. And some states make that incredibly difficult. For instance, I was doing some research on this topic. In the state of Nevada, you have to register by 9 p.m. on the 5th Saturday before the election. Obviously, many people are going to forget which is the 5th Saturday, and thus, if they don't register, they can't vote. Where other states, for instance, Wisconsin, allows you to register to vote and vote on the same day. So that obviously increases voter turnout. Other obstacles that states can put on you, so they can require that you register. They can require that you, if you've committed a felony, that you're not allowed to vote. And states vary in their leniency on that. For some states, it's simply when you're serving time for a sentence. In other states, once you've committed a felony, you lose your right to vote forever. So it simply depends on the state, but that is within federal guidelines. They're allowed to do that. They can also prevent you from voting or require, that you have a photo ID. For instance, in Georgia, in order to vote, you must have a photo ID. In other states, you must prove your citizenship. So all of these things are ways in which the state can, sorry about that, I'm going to a blank screen, I don't want that. All of these are ways in which the state can require you meet certain requirements, but that prevent you from exercising your right to vote. So we call those barriers, and there are many, but so long as the state acts within those general guidelines of the 15th, the 19th, and the 26th Amendment, they are pretty, they have a pretty wide range of discretion in how they execute the vote. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about who votes. So we know who's allowed to vote. Now we want to talk about who actually votes. And when we refer to who votes, that's what we're talking about in turnout. Turnout refers to the number of people that actually come out to vote. And what we know is that turnout in the United States is incredibly low. It's incredibly low compared to other nations. We rank at near the bottom amongst other Western nations who allow their citizens to vote. But even amongst various types of elections in the United States, we see that voting varies quite considerably. For instance, when you look at a national presidential election, about 60% of voters will participate. In a midterm election, which refers to mid-presidential term, remember that every 2 years roughly in America we have elections. So the election that happens mid-presidential term. So for instance, we elected President Obama in 2008. In 2010, we were midway through his 4-year term. That was a midterm election. And generally in midterm elections, we're electing members of the Senate and members of the House. So less than a third of people participate in those midterm elections. On average, about 20% participate in state elections, while only 10% in local. Now, as staggering as those statistics are, let me add an additional layer. Remember that for our elections, we use a system of majority rule, particularly in southern states. Remember, southern states use majority rule, which refers to 50 plus 1% of the vote. So think about it this way. If roughly 60% of Americans are voting for president, and 50 plus 1% of those 60% determine who the president is, that means a little over 30% of Americans are choosing our president. If 20% of Americans participate in state elections, and we take 50 plus 1% of 20%, that means that a little over 10% of the state citizens are picking our state officials, like our governor. And if less than 10% participate in local elections, and we take the winner based on 50 plus 1% of that 10%, that means that a little over 5% of people are selecting our local officials. So its turnout is low when you look at it as a whole number, but when you consider the way that winners are determined using a majority rule system, that becomes even more discouraging. Now, why do we see such low turnout in the United States? Well, there are some real tangible reasons, some real identifiable reasons why we see these differences. And what we know more than anything is it really varies by race, by age, by education, and by income. Now, when we talk about race and age, there isn't something unique about people of a race or people of a certain age that makes them more or less likely to vote. It's really related to education and income. The most important indicator of who will vote is education. Please know that. More than any other factor that influences participation is education. And I hope you can think about the reasons why. Someone who's more educated has more, number one, more knowledge of the system, so they understand the process better. And number two, they better understand how their participation affects the outcome. We call that efficacy, E-F-F-I-C-A-C-Y. Efficacy is the belief that your participation makes a difference in the outcome. And someone that is educated has a better sense that their participation will in fact affect the final outcome of politics, and thus they are more likely to participate. So education is the number one indicator of who will vote. When you combine income and education, you get something called socioeconomic status. And let me bring this up so you can see it here. Socioeconomic status is that combination of income and education, and some would argue occupational prestige. For instance, if you're a doctor or a lawyer versus a garbage person. And again, we know that people with higher education and thus higher socioeconomic status are more likely to participate for the reasons we mentioned a second ago, but also for an additional set of reasons related to their income. If you have more money, you are able to take time off. You're able to spend more time and more money on various types of political activities, where if you're working an hourly job, you rely on public transportation, you're not going to be less likely to have the time to donate to these kinds of extracurricular activities. So we know above all else that socioeconomic status has a direct correlation to one's level of participation. And you can see it here in the statistics that I have, and you'll find these in your textbook. Again, that as someone becomes more educated, they are more likely to participate. 73.3% of college graduates participate, compared to 50.9% of people who've graduated from high school, compared to 23% of people who've never graduated from high school. So you can see that as one becomes more educated, one is more likely to participate. But there are also some related factors, for instance, age and race. As you can see, the older one becomes, the more likely they are to participate. That is what we would call a generational effect, that the older one becomes, the more likely they are to see the role of politics in their individual life, thus the more likely they are to participate. That, and the older one becomes, the more likely they are to be educated, thus the more likely they are to participate as well. The older that one gets, the more likely their income is to rise, thus the more likely they are to participate. Also, the older they become, the more likely they are to have free time. So, for instance, a person, as you see at the bottom of that, between 18 and 24, they're going to likely be in school and working part-time and may have a young family. And so participation in politics ranks relatively low on their to-do, where if you're over 60 or 65, you're likely retired, you have a lot more free time, you may have more disposable income, and thus you can dedicate yourself more to these partisan activities, to these electoral and non-electoral forms of participation. So remember that young people participate at much lower levels than do older people. Now, how do we get young people to participate? Well, here is something interesting, and you can see it on this slide right in front of you, that civic engagement is an important part of getting particularly young people out to vote. Studies show that if you contact someone directly, particularly, they are much more likely to participate. They are much more likely to show up and vote. So one of the ways, and you may remember that Barack Obama did this in 2008 and was incredibly successful in what we call mobilizing, and mobilizing there at the very top, or recruiting people to participate. And if you go out to young people in particular and you contact them, if you talk to them about politics, they are much more likely to participate. So we know that young people don't participate, but we do have some real clues as to how to get them to participate, or how to mobilize them, which is by contacting, which is by going to them directly. Okay, when you look at race, we also know that turnout, that voting and other forms of participation really vary based on race. And you can see this, that whites have the highest level of participation, followed by African Americans, and then there's quite a gap between African Americans and Hispanic Americans, followed closely by Asian Americans. And the question begs asking, why do we see such differences in race? And I think there are a couple of factors that you can point to. Number one, it's obviously related to both education and income. And what we know is that minorities tend to have lower levels of education, and more than anything, lower levels of income. And as we said a moment ago, the lower one's education and income, the lower their socioeconomic status, the more likely, the lower their socioeconomic status, the less likely they are to participate. So we see lower minority participation because of the connection to income and education. The other big thing I would say that belongs here as an explanation for why we see lower levels of minority participation is the process of political socialization. And that's something that we'll talk about in chapter 6. But what we know is that people learn to vote from their families. And if minorities, particularly when you look at Hispanics and Asians, and that is immigrant populations, it takes several generations before we see increased participation. That is, that has to be handed down from generation to generation, which may explain why we see higher levels of African American participation, as they've had the right to vote compared to other groups who are likely to be, either first generation or newly generation, and thus haven't taught their children the value of participating in American politics. In fact, they may not even see this as being their country. So we see varying levels of participation, and again, we can link it to both socioeconomic status and the process of socialization. And then finally, really quickly, just the difference between men and women. Now, men and women, in terms of voting, participate at roughly the same levels. What differs here, though, is women and running for office. And what we know is that women run for and win elected office at much lower rates than their male counterparts. And again, the question begs asking, why? Well, probably the easiest answer is because they fear that people won't vote for them, or they won't be able to raise money. And we know that this is true. If you look at the presidential campaign of Hillary Clinton in 2008, we know that she faced a lot of criticism. And in fact, the largest body of criticism came from other women voters. So women have a harder time running for office because they have a harder time getting people to vote for them. Sort of that age-old stereotype that women are more emotional and are less inclined to be sort of leaders and to make tough choices, and thus people are less likely to vote for them and less likely to donate money. So again, we know that women and men vote at roughly the same rates, but certainly fewer women running for office. So again, it's important that you focus not only on who it is that votes and the rates at which they vote, but to think about the reasons why we see that happen. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about socialization and public opinion in chapter 6, but really think about the role of income and education and how it affects voter turnout.